In the fall of 1961, at a county tax delinquency sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old farmer named Harlan Detweiler paid $40 for 12 acres of standing timber that the Grundy County Appraiser had valued at $800 and recommended the county sell for scrap. Let me tell you what that timber looked like, because the appraisal tells you everything you need to know about who was making decisions in Grundy County that year. The 12 acres sat in the northwest corner of a farm that had belonged to a man named Elton Graber, who died in the spring of 1960 with no heirs and a property tax bill 3 years overdue. The county took the land, sold the tillable acres to a neighbor for $400 per acre, and was left with the timber parcel, which sat on a creek bottom, with standing water 6 months of the year, and a slope the county road commissioner described in his notes as not worth graveling. The appraiser walked the parcel in August, counted the trees from the edge of the access road, and wrote in his report that the timber consisted of approximately 40 mature bur oaks in poor condition, a stand of cottonwood he described as commercially worthless, and miscellaneous understory that he recommended be cleared for eventual row crop conversion. His estimate of $800 assumed a timber buyer would come in, cut what was sellable, and leave the rest. Nobody came. The county dropped the opening bid to $400. Nobody came. They dropped it to $200. A scrap timber dealer from Ames drove out, walked the edge of the parcel for 10 minutes, and told the county agent the cottonwood wasn't worth hauling, and the oaks were too far off a paved road to justify the skidding cost. He bid $35. Harlan Detweiler bid $40. The county agent took the $40, handed over a deed, and went back inside. Harlan's brother-in-law, a man named Clifton Yancey, who farmed 320 acres in the next township and considered himself a practical thinker, heard about the purchase at the Grundy Center Co-op the following Thursday. He drove out to Harlan's place that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Harlan, you paid $40 for trees the county couldn't give away. What in the world are you going to do with that?" Harlan told him he was going to build a barn. Clifton looked at him for a moment. Then he drove home and told his wife, and his wife told the women's circle at First Methodist. And by the following Sunday, the story had made its way from the co-op to the diner, on 5th Street to the church parking lots of two denominations. The version that circulated was not unkind exactly. It was the version a community tells about a man it has already decided is a little different. He paid $40 for condemned timber. He thinks he's going to build a barn. The telling always ended with a pause and a slow shake of the head, which in Grundy County in 1961 was the local equivalent of a verdict. They were wrong. But let me tell you about Harlan Detweiler, because what he did with that timber only makes sense if you understand who he was. Harlan Detweiler was born in 1930 on a 160-acre farm 3 miles east of Grundy Center. His father was a man named August Detweiler, and August was, without qualification or exaggeration, the most capable man with wood and hand tools that Grundy County produced in the first half of the 20th century. August had learned his trade from his own father, who had come from Pennsylvania with a set of hand planes and a draw knife and a philosophy about wood that could be summarized in a single sentence. A tree is a building that hasn't been told what it is yet. Auguste ran a small sawmill operation off the back of his property from 1924 until 1952. A portable rig he'd built himself around a 36-inch circular blade, driven by a flat belt pulley, off a Farmhouse M. He milled lumber for neighbors, for the county, for the Lutheran Church in Grundy Center, for the new grain elevator in Rhinebeck. He charged by the board foot, and he kept every receipt in a cigar box on the workbench. And he knew to the penny what every piece of wood that came off his mill was worth. The shop behind the Detweiler house was a structure August had built himself in 1931 from timber he'd milled off his own property, and it was still standing in 1961, with no more settlement than a 1/4 inch at the northeast corner. Concrete floor poured 4 inches thick with rebar. August had scavenged from a road project. Tin roof with a 2-foot overhang on all 4 sides. A wood stove made from a 55-gallon drum with a cast iron door. August had bought at a farm sale in 1928 for 75 cents. The workbench was 12 feet long and 2 inches thick, white oak planked, with a leg vise at one end that August had made from a piece of 2-inch steel plate, and a length of 1-inch rod he'd threaded himself on the lathe. The lathe was a South Bend 9-inch that August had bought second-hand in 1935, and it still had the original chuck and the original tool rest and a coffee can of cutting oil on the shelf above it that Harlan would not throw away for the rest of his life. The mill itself, the 36-inch rig, sat under a lean-to on the south side of the shop, covered with a canvas tarp that August had oiled every spring since 1946. Harlan grew up in that shop. He was milling lumber alongside his father by the time he was 12. He could read the grain of a log by looking at the end cut and tell you which way to orient it on the carriage for the straightest boards. He understood that bur oak dried differently than red oak, that cottonwood had uses people dismissed because they didn't understand its compression strength, that the difference between a good mill cut and a bad one was the feed rate, not the blade. August taught him all of this not as lessons but as work, which is the only way any of it actually transfers. August Detweiler died in March of 1958, a Tuesday morning sitting in the chair by the wood stove in the shop. He was 67 years old. He had paid off the farm in 1947 and had not borrowed money for any purpose after that date. He left Harlan the farm, the shop, the mill, the tools, and a savings account at the Grundy County State Bank with $14,200 in it, which in 1958 represented approximately 12 years of careful accumulation on a 160-acre operation in central Iowa. Harlan was 28 years old when his father died. He had never left Grundy County for longer than a week. He had never borrowed money. He had never bought a piece of equipment he couldn't pay for in full. These were not accidents of circumstance. They were decisions, made the same way August had made them, one at a time, over years, without announcement. Now, the timber. When Harlan Detweiler looked at those 12 acres on the Graber Creek bottom, he did not see what the county appraiser saw. Let me tell you what Harlan had done 6 months before that tax sale, because this is where the story stops being about a strange purchase and starts being about something else entirely. In April of 1961, Harlan had driven the mill rig out to the creek bottom parcel for the first time, not to buy it, but to look at it. He'd heard about the county's trouble selling the timber from a man named Ed Pfeiffer at the elevator, and he'd driven out on a Wednesday afternoon after he'd finished disking the south field. He walked the 12 acres in rubber boots, in standing water up to his ankles in the low spots, and he did not walk the edge of the parcel the way the scrap dealer from Ames would do 6 months later. He walked every row. He put his hand on every bur oak. He counted 44 mature trees, not 40, with a diameter at breast height ranging from 18 inches to 31 inches. He cut a small window in the bark on 3 of the largest trees with his jackknife and looked at the wood underneath. He found clear, tight-grained heartwood on all 3. The county appraiser had called the oaks poor condition because several of them had dead upper branches and surface bark damage from a lightning strike in 1957. Harlan knew that lightning damage in the upper canopy of a mature bur oak tells you almost nothing about the quality of the wood in the lower trunk, which is the only part of the tree a sawyer cares about. He walked the cottonwood stand separately. There were 23 mature cottonwood trees, which the appraiser had written off entirely. Harlan stood in the middle of them for a while. Cottonwood gets dismissed because it's soft and it moves with moisture, and it doesn't hold a nail the way oak does. But Harlan's father had milled cottonwood for interior sheathing, for subflooring, for temporary formboards, for dozens of applications where you needed a wide, light, stable panel and didn't need structural strength. He calculated, standing in that cottonwood stand in April, that he was looking at somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 board feet of usable lumber in those 23 trees alone. He went home and got out a piece of graph paper and drew the barn he needed. Harlan had been farming with his father's 1948 bank barn since he'd inherited the place, and the north wall had been failing for 3 years. The foundation had heaved, the sill plate was rotted through on the east side, and the roof over the haymow leaked in 2 places he'd patched with tar and would need to patch again. He needed a new equipment storage structure, 60 by 40 feet, with a 14-foot clear span on the interior for the combine and the grain wagon. He'd priced it from a pole barn contractor in Waterloo the previous fall. The quote was $4,800 for materials and labor, which was money Harlan had but was not willing to spend. He drew the barn on graph paper at the kitchen table. He calculated the lumber requirement. He calculated what the Graber timber would yield. He calculated the milling time. He wrote the number $40 in the corner of the graph paper and circled it. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a man pay $40 for trees the county couldn't sell. They were watching a man execute the first step of a plan he'd been carrying in his head since April. Let me tell you about the build, because this is where Harlan Detweiler proved that a factory builds what it can sell, but a man with his father's mill builds what he needs. He started felling in October of 1961, 2 weeks after the tax sale. He worked the creek bottom in the mornings before the ground froze and moved the mill rig out to the parcel on the 3rd Saturday of October. He felled and skidded the bur oaks first, using the Farmhouse and a logging chain, working alone except for 2 Saturdays when his neighbor, a man named Vernon Schrock, came out and helped him manage the larger logs. The 31-inch oak, the largest on the parcel, took them 40 minutes to fall safely and another hour to skid to the mill site on the high ground at the parcel's east edge. Harlan milled as he felled, running the logs through the 36-inch blade the same day they came off the stump when possible, because fresh-cut oak mills, cleaner, and with less blade stress than wood that started to check. He cut the structural members first, the posts, the girts, the rafters. He cut them full dimension, not nominal. A 6 by 6 post off Harlan's mill was actually 6 inches by 6 inches, not 5.5 by 5.5 the way a lumber yard would sell you. He cut the sill plates at 3 inches thick, 8 inches wide. He cut the rafters at 2 by 6 full dimension. He stickered every piece of lumber on the high ground at the mill site with inch-thick spacers between the courses, covered the stacks with tin sheets weighted with rocks, and let the wood begin its air drying while he finished felling. The cottonwood he milled last, in November, cutting it into 1-inch boards for the siding and the interior sheathing. He got 5,200 board feet of usable lumber from the cottonwood stand, which was in the middle of his April estimate. The boards were wide, some of them 18 and 20 inches across, the kind of dimension you simply cannot buy from a lumber yard in 1961, because the old growth stock that produced boards that wide had been gone from commercial supply for 30 years. He moved the lumber to his farm in December, stacking it in the equipment shed to continue drying through the winter. He did not begin framing until April of 1962, when the ground had firmed and the lumber had been drying for 5 to 6 months, which for full-dimension green-cut hardwood in Iowa is the minimum you want before you start putting it under load. The foundation was concrete block, which Harlan laid himself over 3 weekends in March, using block he'd bought from the Grundy Center lumber yard. The block cost $112. He set the sill plates in May. The posts went up in June, 8 of them, each one a single piece of 6x6 bur oak, 14 feet long, cut from the lower trunk sections of the largest trees. Harlan had mortised the post bases by hand with a 2-inch chisel and a mallet, cutting the tenons on the sill plates with a handsaw and a shoulder plane from his father's tool chest. The joinery was not decorative, it was structural. The same timber frame joinery August had used on the shop in 1931, and it would distribute load across the full face of the joint, rather than concentrating it at a bolt hole. The girts were 3x8 bur oak, spanning 10 feet between posts, mortised and pegged with 1-inch white oak, pegs Harlan had turned on his father's South Bend lathe. The cutting oil was still in the reservoir. He used it. The rafters were 2x6 full dimension, spaced 24 inches on center, cut from the mid-grade oak that wasn't clear enough for structural members, but was more than adequate for roof framing. He cut the birds' mouths on a saw bench he'd built from scrap cottonwood, using a bevel gauge set to the roof pitch he'd calculated on the graph paper in October. The pitch was 4 and 12, shallow enough to shed snow without overloading the rafters, steep enough to drain rain before it could find a seam. The siding went on in August. He used the cottonwood boards, applied vertically with a 1x3 batten, over each joint, a board and batten pattern that his father had used on every outbuilding on the home place. He painted it with red iron oxide paint, mixed from pigment and linseed oil, a formula August had written in pencil on the inside cover of a notebook that Harlan kept on the workbench shelf. The roofing was the one thing he bought new. Corrugated galvanized steel panels from the lumber yard in Rhinebeck. That cost $218. Let me give you the full accounting, because this is the part that changes how you hear everything that came before it. The timber parcel, $40. Concrete block for the foundation, $100 to $12. Roofing steel, $218. Hardware, bolts, lag screws, hinges, door track, nails, $47. Glazing for 2 windows, $14. Linseed oil and pigment for 3 coats of paint, $22. Miscellaneous, $18. Total, $471. The pole barn contractor in Waterloo had quoted him $4,800. Harlan built a better barn than the contractor would have built for $471. And the difference between those two numbers, $4,329, went into the savings account at Grundy County State Bank, alongside everything else he didn't spend. Vernon Schrock came over on the Saturday in September 1962, when Harlan hung the last door. Vernon had helped with the log skidding the previous October and had heard the story the same way everyone else in the township had heard it, with the same slow head shake. He stood in the open doorway of the finished barn for a while without saying anything. He walked the interior, running his hand along one of the 6x6 posts. He looked up at the roof framing. He came back to where Harlan was standing and took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "What did the lumber cost you?" Harlan said, $40. Vernon looked at the post again. He said, "August would have liked this." Harlan said, "That's why I built it this way." That was the whole conversation. But Vernon Schrock told the story differently than Clifton Yancey had told it. Clifton had told it as a punchline. Vernon told it as a fact to farmers, in the specific way that farmers tell each other things they've seen with their own eyes, which carries a weight that no second-hand account can match. By the end of that fall, the story in Grundy County had shifted from Harlan paid $40 for condemned timber to Harlan built a 60-by-40 barn for under $500. And those are two very different stories. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone for years, and then watched that community go quiet when the proof arrived, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this one isn't over. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 18 years, because this is where the story stops being about a barn and starts being about something else entirely. Harlan Detweiler farmed his 160 acres through the 1960s and into the 1970s with no debt and no partners. He bought a used combine in 1964, a 1958 Massey Harris 82, for $900 cash at a farm sale outside of Conrad. He overhauled it in his father's shop over the winter and ran it for 11 years before he sold it for $600 and bought a slightly newer machine. He bought a used grain dryer in 1967 for $340. He repaired it himself. He added 40 acres in 1969 when the farm to his east came up for sale, paying $280 per acre, $11,200 total from savings. He added another 80 acres in 1974 at $420 per acre. He kept the savings account current. He kept the ledger current. He did not borrow money. The barn he built from the Graber timber was, by 1975, 14 years old and showed no movement, no settlement, no rot at the sill plates, no sag in the roofline. The cottonwood siding had been repainted twice with the same linseed oil formula from August's notebook. The bur oak posts had developed the dark, hard surface that old-growth oak develops under load over time, a patina that is not cosmetic but structural, the wood's response to sustained compression. A building inspector from the county came out in 1971 to assess a neighboring property and stopped to look at Harlan's barn on his way past. He walked around it twice. He told Harlan it was the best framed agricultural structure he'd seen in Grundy County. Harlan thanked him and went back to work. By 1978, Harlan had $91,000 in the Grundy County State Bank. He had 280 acres of paid-for land, a paid-for equipment line, a paid-for shop, and a paid-for barn built from timber the county had valued at $800 and sold for $40. His annual operating costs were feed, fuel, seed, fertilizer, and property tax. He owed nothing to anyone. This is not a remarkable achievement in the abstract. In the context of what was coming, it was the only thing that mattered. You know what happened in the early 1980s. Interest rates climbed to 18, 19, 20%. Land values that had been rising through the 1970s, pulling farmers into expansion loans and operating lines that made sense at 8%, collapsed. Corn dropped below $2.50 a bushel. Soybean prices fell. The operating loans that had seemed manageable in 1977 became impossible in 1981. The land that had been collateral was worth less than the debt it secured. Grundy County lost 23 farms to foreclosure between 1981 and 1986. Not 23 bad farmers, not 23 careless men. 23 operations that had been built, in the language of that era, on borrowed momentum. And when the momentum stopped, the borrowing didn't. Vernon Schrock's son, a man named Dale, who had taken over his father's 320 acres in 1975 and expanded to 480 acres with a federal land bank loan at 14%, sold 160 acres in 1983 at $800 per acre to cover an operating shortfall. He kept the home place. He told Harlan at the co-op that fall that he'd done the arithmetic 6 different ways, and it always came out the same. Harlan listened. He didn't say anything that wasn't useful. A man named Gerald Reinhardt, who farmed 640 acres, 2 townships east, and had been one of the louder voices in the Clifton Yancey version of the condemned timber story 20 years earlier, lost his entire operation in 1984. The bank took the land, the equipment, the bins, and the shop. Gerald was 54 years old. He had farmed that ground for 29 years. He was not a bad farmer. He had built his operation on borrowed money at borrowed rates. And when both the money and the rates moved against him at the same time, there was nothing to hold on to. Harlan watched all of this from a farm with no debt and $91,000 in savings, and he watched it not with satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about watching men he'd known his whole life lose ground their fathers had broken. He watched it with a quiet sadness that he did not discuss with anyone, because discussing it would have required him to explain the difference between his situation and theirs, and that explanation would have sounded like a verdict, which he had no interest in delivering. In the spring of 1984, 160 acres of farmland adjacent to Harlan's east boundary came to a foreclosure auction. It was the Reinhardt ground. Good ground, Class B soil, tile drained, with a set of bins that Gerald had put up in 1972. The opening bid was $600 per acre, set by the bank. 2 investors from Des Moines were in the crowd. A farmland management company from Ames had sent a representative. There were a handful of local farmers who had survived the crisis well enough to be standing at an auction in the spring of 1984, which was itself a form of selection. Harlan Detweiler was there. He was 54 years old. He had driven over in his truck and stood near the back of the crowd with his hands in his jacket pockets. The bidding opened at $600. It moved to $650, then $700. The Des Moines investors pushed it to $750. The farmland management company bid $800. One of the investors went to $825. The other dropped out. The management company went to $850. Harlan bid $900. The management company bid $925. Harlan bid $975. The management company paused. Their representative was a young man with a clipboard who had driven up from Ames that morning and had a ceiling written on the clipboard that Harlan could not see. The ceiling was $950 per acre. The management company dropped out. Harlan Dietweiler bought 160 acres of Grundy County farmland at $975 per acre, $156,000 total, and he paid for it with the cashier's check he had obtained from the Grundy County State Bank the previous morning, because he had known approximately what the bidding would reach, and he had not wanted to write a personal check at a foreclosure auction in front of people he'd known his whole life. The crowd went quiet, not politely quiet, not respectfully quiet. The particular quiet that settles over a group of people who are simultaneously rearranging everything they thought they knew about a man, recalculating a story that had started 23 years earlier with $40 and condemned timber and a slow shake of the head, and arriving, all of them, at roughly the same moment, at the understanding that the man they had found quietly amusing in 1961 had been right about something they had not understood was even a question. Clifton Yancey was in the crowd. He was 61 years old and had survived the farm crisis with his 320 acres intact, which was its own kind of achievement. He found Harlan after the auction and stood with him by the truck for a moment. He said, "Harlan, I owe you an apology for what I said about those trees." Harlan looked at him. He said, "Clifton, you didn't say anything wrong. You just didn't have all the information." That was the whole conversation. But it was the conversation Clifton Yancey repeated for the rest of his life, because it was the most accurate thing anyone had said to him in 23 years. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that August Dietweiler would have understood without a word of explanation. Harlan farmed his 440 acres through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s. He rebuilt the old Reinhardt bins in 1986, replacing the floor sweep and the aeration system himself, using parts he'd sourced from a bin manufacturer in Marshalltown, and installed over a single weekend with help from Dale Schrock, who had learned by that point to show up when Harlan Dietweiler had a project. He added a lean-to the 1962 barn in 1989 for additional equipment storage, framing it with oak he milled from 3 trees he'd taken off a fence line on the Reinhardt ground. The lean-to cost $140 in materials. He had a niece named Carol, his sister's daughter, who had grown up one farm over and had spent more time in August's shop than most adults twice her age. Carol was not a farmer by training. She had studied accounting in Cedar Falls and come back to Grundy County in 1987 because, as she told Harlan, the numbers made more sense out here than they did in the city, by which she meant something more than arithmetic. She started helping Harlan with the books in 1988. By 1991, she was running the operation alongside him. By 1994, when Harlan was 64, and his knees had begun to register their objections to 40 years of farm work, she was running it. Carol's son, a boy named Thomas, was 14 in 1996 and spent his after-school hours in August's shop the same way Carol had, and Harlan had, and August himself had, learning the lathe and the mill and the hand planes and the specific patience that a piece of wood demands before it will tell you what it is. Harlan showed him how to read the end grain of a log. He showed him how to set the feed rate on the mill. He showed him the cigar box of receipts from 1924 to 1952, which was still on the workbench shelf, and he explained what each receipt represented, not as history, but as arithmetic, because August had taught him that arithmetic and history are usually the same subject. In the fall of 1997, the Grundy County Farm Bureau asked Harlan to speak at their annual meeting. He was 67 years old and had not spoken publicly about farming or money or any of the things he'd spent his life demonstrating. He agreed on the condition that he could say what he thought rather than what was expected. He stood up in front of 140 farmers in the Grundy Center Community Building and spoke for 11 minutes without notes. He told them about the 12 acres of condemned timber. He told them about the $40 and the graph paper and the 5,200 board feet of cottonwood siding. He told them about the $471 barn and the $4,800 quote from the Waterloo contractor. He told them about the $91,000 in savings in 1978 and the cashier's check in 1984. He said, "I am not telling you this because I was smarter than anyone in this room. I am telling you because my father taught me one thing that I have never found a reason to doubt, which is that the only costs you control are the ones you don't incur. A factory builds what it can sell. A man with a mill builds what he needs. The difference between those two things, compounded over 20 years, is the difference between buying your neighbor's land and losing your own." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that is too plain to argue with. A woman in the third row, a farmer from the east side of the county who had lost 80 acres in 1983 and spent the next 14 years buying it back, asked him how he'd known the crisis was coming. Harlan said he hadn't known. He said he'd just tried not to owe anyone anything. And when the crisis came, that turned out to be the right preparation, not because he'd predicted the future, but because it's always the right preparation. The room stayed quiet a little longer after that. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at 12 acres of condemned timber on a creek bottom, standing water 6 months of the year, 40 mature bur oaks with lightning damage in the upper canopy, a cottonwood stand the appraiser called commercially worthless? The county appraiser saw $800 in a problem. The scrap dealer from Ames saw a haul that wasn't worth the diesel. Clifton Yancey saw a punchline. Harlan D. Twyler saw a 60 by 40 barn with full-dimension structural members, 5,200 board feet of wide cottonwood siding, and the difference between $471 and $4,800, which was $4,329, which was the first installment on 160 acres of Grundy County farmland that he would buy with a cashier's check 23 years later, while a crowd of people rearranged everything they thought they knew. That's the difference between someone who buys and someone who builds. $40. A condemned creek bottom. A mill his father built in 1924. The timber nobody wanted, milled by the man nobody understood, into the barn that outlasted everything they said would last instead.